Good morning, everyone. Thanks again for stopping in for my live Q&A session for the week. Like I said, I just wanted to do these periodically, and when questions come in, this is a great forum for us to be able to get the answers out there to everybody. Like I said, you may have had a problem with an emulsion in the past or some aspect of screen printing in the past, and other people can learn from those problems. So once again, if you just want to put your questions down in the chat area, I'd be happy to address them. I've got a few questions that were submitted ahead of time for people that wouldn't be able to jump on live here and want to watch it later. But yeah, when you've got questions, please drop them down in the live chat, and we'll go from there. I'll start off with some of the questions that were submitted to me via email ahead of time. I had somebody recently just ask, what is the best emulsion to start with as a newbie? Fresh into screen printing, haven't done it before. What's the best emulsion to start with as a newbie? So there's a couple different directions that you can go with this. Obviously, the emulsion has to work with the ink system that you're printing. If you're working with water-based or discharge inks, it needs to be a water-resistant ink. If you're just working with plastisol, virtually any emulsion is going to work with plastisol, and that's most likely what I would recommend. If you're just getting into textile printing, you're just getting into screen printing, dip your toes in and start with plastisol. It's a much easier system than some of the others that are out there. But there's a couple different ways you can go. So with Chroma Blue being a pure photopolymer, you don't have to mix it, so it has an extended shelf life. With that, it's high in solids, so you only have to coat it 1-in-1, making it a lot easier as well to get a really good gasket for somebody that's kind of new into printing. Something that's a little higher in solids is going to be easier to build your screen faster and more consistently. But also, it kind of goes back to the environment that you're working in too. If you're working in an environment that's not as light safe as one would hope, hopefully you're working under light safe conditions. But if you're not working in perfect light safe conditions, you might want to start with something like a dual cure emulsion, like maybe our UDCHV, which being a dual cure is slower exposing, so it's going to be far more forgiving to any residual UV light that's getting into that room. So, like I said, there's a couple different ways. Chroma Blue, UDCHV, either one of those would be a very good emulsion to start with, which are both very user-friendly. I had another question that came in to me this week. They were moving their facility, and they were looking for the best way to set up their screen room. The best way, you just have to think of your workflow. So you want to coat screens, move them into a drying area, move them into your exposure area or imaging area if you've got a direct-to-screen system. The biggest thing about setting up a screen room that I think is the far most important is to keep your wet area completely separate from your dry area. So where you've got screens coating and drying and where you're doing your exposing and imaging should be separate than your area that you're washing out your screens, developing screens, reclaiming screens. If you can keep those as far separate from each other, that's going to help with humidity-related issues, which are some of the most common issues that people run into in screen rooms. Sean, I do not have AC in my workshop. Can you offer some tips and tricks when working in a high humid environment? Yeah, so I mean, obviously keeping your environment consistent is going to be your best, but this time of year, obviously, it's difficult, especially if you don't have AC in your screen room. But you can use drying cabinets. You can do a DIY drying cabinet. The biggest thing is getting the moisture out of those screens, but keep in mind that emulsion is hygroscopic. So when the emulsion is dry, even if you have a fully dry screen, you bring it into a humid environment, it's going to start sucking up all of that moisture. So if you can keep the wet area separate from the dry area, that's really going to help with that as well. But air circulation will really help. So if you've got fans that are going in that area to dry your screens, don't have the fan pointed directly at your screens, because fans are really good at collecting dust and debris over time. So if you take a dirty fan and you blow it on your wet screens, all that dust and debris is just going to blow all over your screens, which will turn into pinholes later on when you get to press or during the exposure process. But yeah, in humidity it's a really tough time for screen rooms. One thing, if you're just doing plastisol printing, our Chromaline is designed to help fight against humidity. So if you run into issues where films are sticking to your screens, I would recommend testing something like our Chromaline, which is a very humidity resistant product. But like I said, airflow is best, but don't have those fans blowing directly on those screens. Have them air circulation in the room, but not directly on those fans. And then also dehumidifiers. Dehumidifiers are essential, I think, for every screen room. Doesn't make a difference if you've got AC and you've got a perfect screen room environment, but a dehumidifier will help suck some of that moisture out of the air as well. But if you do have a dehumidifier, make sure that you connect the hose to it. There's always usually a hose attachment, and run that drip line outside of the screen room instead of just collecting in the bucket. So if the water is just collecting in the bucket and you have to be diligent about dumping that bucket, it's still going to be helping, but the water that's collecting that bucket, keep in mind, is just going to keep evaporating back into the screen. So it's going to into that screen room. So it's going to be a continuous cycle over and over and over. If you've got that line completely going out of the room, that way all of the water is being sucked out of the air and sucked out of the environment is going to be brought out of the room. Michaela, is there a way to repair pinholes when you're in a pinch? Yeah, if you're on press and if you've got a pinhole on press, most people just use tape. That's a really good Band-Aid solution. If you're having a pinhole issue that's reoccurring, try to keep in mind and mindful of where that pinhole is. If there seems to be pinholes that are always happening in the same spot in a screen, maybe it's your glass of your exposure unit that needs to be cleaned off. There could be something on the glass that's blocking the light to your screen if it seems like a pinhole is always relatively in that same area. But yeah, pinholes on press, easily just tape them off and go. Before press, using blockout, like something like our Chromafill is a great blockout, but it's essentially just almost like an emulsion that doesn't have the light sensitive capabilities. So you would just coat it on wet, let it dry. But if it happens on press, tape is definitely the best way. Gus, what's the life of a screen after coated on the rack? Okay, so a lot of times that's going to go back to the environment that the screen is being stored in as well. And it will also go back to the type of emulsion. If you've got a pure photopolymer, if it's stored in a perfectly dark, dry environment, that screen could, you could keep it in there for up to a month. Usually I don't like to store screens longer than a month, just because chances are it's going to get hit by some sort of light. The humidity, the environment is going to play to an effect in that screen. I typically say a month at max, but best case scenario is always coat today, use tomorrow. I know that's usually not feasible for most people, but if you can use them within that week that you coat those screens, or a week after those screens are dry, that's ideal. But if it's something that you're running into, you just are slow and you've got screens that are coated and you want to make sure that you can use them down the road, make sure you keep them in a completely dark, dry environment, and you're going to have a better chance of using that screen further down the road. But yeah, great questions. I've got another one here. I had a customer that the emulsion was locking in their screen. So what they're saying about locking in their screen, when they go to reclaim the screen, reclaimer really wasn't breaking down the emulsion. That can go back to a few different things. First of all, I always want to be cautious to customers that after you put the reclaimer on the screen, don't let it sit on there for so long that the reclaimer starts to dry on the screen. If you put reclaimer on the screen and it starts to dry, it's really going to lock in that emulsion, and it's actually going to work against you, against what the reclaimer is designed to do. But primarily when I see people with screens that are locking in, they're using, a lot of times they're using a pure photopolymer. That screen has been underexposed. And if the screen is underexposed and you hit it with a hot solvent on press, that's another way that could potentially lock in that emulsion, making it far more difficult to reclaim down the road. So those are typically the two factors that I look to. An underexposed stencil is always going to reclaim a lot harder than a properly exposed stencil, or even an overexposed stencil. Underexposure is one of the biggest causes for emulsion just not reclaiming very well. Yeah. Let's see if we got some more popping in here. I did have one more question that came in ahead of time. They were having, during the washing out process after exposure, their screen just wasn't washing out. It just wasn't developing. And they were asking me, what are potential causes of the screen not washing out properly? The most common is overexposure. If you don't have your exposure time dialed in and you're exposing far over, chances are that's going to lead to your screen not washing out very well. Also, it could go back to your film positive might not be printed very dark, or you could be using something like vellum. If you're using something like vellum and the light is passing through the dark printed area of your film and not blocking that UV light, the light is passing through there and hardening the image area of your emulsion, just like it's hardening the non-image area of your emulsion. So if you go to wash your screen out, it's been hardened through, it's not going to develop very well or at all. The third cause that's typically leading to screens that don't develop properly is pre-exposure. So if you coat your screens and they're in an environment that there's white light getting in there, or you're coating your screens in an area that isn't UV light safe, it's affecting and it's exposing those screens before you go to use it in your exposure unit. The main thing that I look for if it's pre-exposure is when the screen goes to when you go to develop the screen, that your image area almost peels away. So it's almost like it's been exposed in layers. That outer layer of the emulsion is exposed, but the inner layer still hasn't been exposed. That's one thing that I look for as far as pre-exposure. If it kind of peels away instead of melts away like it should during developing, that's telling me that light got to that screen in some sort of capacity before you went to expose it during the exposure process. Yeah. Yeah, like I said, I just wanted to jump on here from time to time. If people have questions, like I said, this is a great forum. People can learn from issues that you're having or have had that maybe they've never had, but doesn't mean that they won't down the road. Everybody knows that sometimes making screens can be very temperamental. So if we can learn from other people's mistakes and other people's issues that they've had, it's something that this is a great way other people can learn from. What can I do if my prints are bleeding? That would go back to what you're referring to as bleeding. Are you referring to your image area is actually seeping out around it, or are you saying that the garment colors are actually bleeding through your print? So I can touch on both of those. If your screens your image area is actually bleeding out from that, and instead of having a nice sharp crisp area and the image seems to be spreading or quote unquote bleeding out, that could be from underexposure. It could be from too thin of a stencil. Um, it could be from a really bad film positive that isn't giving you really good definition. So if your image area isn't nice and crisp and clean, and it seems to be spreading and bleeding, those are some of the potential causes. If you're referring to bleeding as the ink, the color of the garment bleeding through, typically that's from through the print. Okay, they are not very sharp. Yeah, so it sounds like you've got both of those issues. It could be that you're curing your inks at too high of a temperature, and the dye pigments are actually sublimating through the ink. But yes, also if it seems to be bleeding out, the images aren't very sharp. It could be that you have too thin of a stencil. Maybe put one extra pass on that. It could be that your screens are slightly underexposed. Or it could be that the film positive that you're using just isn't as clean or as sharp. Those are some of the most common causes of not very sharp images and the image bleeding out from the sides. RK34. What is the difference between your economy and premium emulsions? So it really goes back to what's in the bucket. So you'll hear us talk about the solid contents of the emulsions. Something that's a higher solids emulsion, it might be more quote unquote premium, because the solids are, after you coat your screen, are what's left on that screen. All of the other portions, so say you have an emulsion that's 50% solids, the other 50% of that bucket is water, and when you coat your screen, if it's 50% solids, half of what you put on that screen is going to evaporate away. So if you're using more of a quote-unquote economy brand, or it's lower in solids, chances are you'll have to use more emulsion to get that same thickness of EOM. So it could go back to the solid content. It could go back to the raw materials that we're using. So different polymers from different manufacturers that we get them in for, the raw materials that we use. Those raw materials, obviously, some are more premium and some are a little more economy branded as well. But it really goes back to what's in that bucket. What's the chemical makeup and certain things that an emulsion that's going to be more water resistant, more of a hybrid emulsion, might cost us more on the raw material side. So the cost of that emulsion might have to be a little higher, just because of the raw materials that are used in there. But typically it's going to go back to solid content, raw materials, the size of the particles. If we're using a much finer ground particle in that helps to resolve much finer details, that's going to cost more than something that is using larger particle sizes. So one way of making a cheap emulsion is using large particle sizes. You're not going to be able to resolve down to as fine of details as you could with, say, like our electronics emulsion. Our electronics emulsion, we can resolve down to 15 micron lines, 15 to 20 micron lines. That's, our red blood cells, 8 microns wide. So we're using extremely fine particle sizes. And some of those raw materials that are in that cost us quite a bit more from that side as well. Susie, I want to start using Chromaline this summer. Do you suggest a specific brand of inks that you've heard of or seen work great with lime? Typically, any of the plastisols that are out there are great working with the lime. Lime, like I said before, is great for the humid season. It's really good for any time of the year, but it's really designed to fight humidity. But any of the plastisol inks that are out there work great with it. I've worked with pretty much any of the plastisol manufacturers. There's pros and cons to each one of their inks that are out there. But I suggest getting in touch with the ink manufacturers and start to build a relationship with them as well. They'll be able to tell you the differences, because, if you look at the ink manufacturers that are out there, it seems like all of them have about 15 different white inks. Well, what's the difference between each one of those white inks? There's it could go back to viscosity or the temperatures that they can cure at. But I always recommend building a relationship with the distributors and the ink manufacturers, and the people that support you the best are the people that I would recommend working with. But any of the plastisol inks that are out there will work great. What is the proper humidity level that you should have in your emulsion on a coated screen? So in the room, the environment that you're coating your screens and drying your screens in, I typically try to keep your relative humidity somewhere between about 30 and 40%. That's the target that I look for. If you can get it below 40, great. If you can hit that 30% relative humidity, even better. When you go above that, sometimes obviously it's going to take a lot longer for your screens to dry, but it could also lead to the fact that all the moisture never leaves that screen. Say you have screens that are drying in an area, you coat another rack of screens and put it in that same area. Well, now all the water is evaporating out of those screens that are drying back into the air, and that water and that humidity is going back into the air, can go right back into the other screens that are thoroughly dry. So if you keep your relative humidity somewhere between 30 and 40%, that's really going to help in your screen room environment. But target perfect is 30%, but 30 to 40 will be great. Also, is there a way to test the humidity of the emulsion and not just in the drying cabinet? Yeah, I mean, like I said, like the humidity gauges, the humidity meters that are out there, I always recommend putting one on your wall in your screen room so that you can look and see that, okay, in my screen room today, it's at 50%. Well, is it because there's higher humidity in the outside just because of what's going on with the weather and stuff? Or is it the fact that you've got a dehumidifier in there that has been collecting into the bucket, you forgot to dump that bucket, and all that water starts going back into the air? But yeah, you can just get one of those little humidity gauges and put it on your wall. I do have a little humidity gauge that I like to use as well. So this is the HumiCheck by CFAR, and this will actually test the moisture that is in your screen. So say you've got a screen, and let's show how this works here. There's a little sensor on the back that's flat, and it just checks the amount of moisture that is in that emulsion. So if I put this on the screen, you'll see that there's a little green light there, and as that's not moving, that's telling me that screen is dry. If this would go all the way up to where it's red, that would tell me that screen is not dry. So something like, I've got a piece of capillary film here. There's a little moisture in this right now. You can see just see right here that there's moisture in this capillary film right here from something I was doing earlier. But this is a really good gauge to check your screens. Then you know if your screen is being thoroughly dried. Art. For a good uniform stencil, would you suggest applying 2 and 2 coating, passes on the shirt side followed by 1 pass on the squeegee side, or 1 pass on the shirt side followed by 2 passes on the squeegee side? Really, in my experience, it doesn't matter, just as long as your last pass always comes from the squeegee side, because you want all of your emulsion deposit on the bottom side of the screen. So if you coat it 2 and 1, 2 and 2, 1 and 1, it really doesn't matter, just as long as that last pass comes from the squeegee side, pushing all of your emulsion deposit through to the bottom side of your screen. Now, if you were to do 2 passes on the shirt side and then 1 on the squeegee side versus 1 on the shirt side followed by 2 on the squeegee side, it might give you a different EOM. But the biggest thing is just doing everything consistently. If you do everything consistently, always the same way, it doesn't matter as long as that last pass is always from the squeegee side, because then you're going to keep things consistency. And consistency is key for a screen room. But yeah, there would be a little bit difference. There would be a little bit of a difference between both of those EOM wise. It won't be significant, but I would always do it the exact same way, regardless if you do it 2 and 1 or 1 and 2. Just do it the same way, and you'll be fine. Yeah, great, good questions. I like to mention. So now we do have a small automatic screen coder. It's a little bit more affordable than some of the other ones that were, between $20,000 and $30,000 that are out there to do 2 screens at once. This one's a little bit more economy based. So it's really consistent. It's built really well, but it doesn't have all the bells and whistles as some of the larger coders that are out there. And it can only do 1 screen at one time. But consistency, an automatic screen coder like our ChromaCoat 20 is a great way of having consistency in your screen room. I mean, I've been coding screens for a really long time, and I can do a really good job about it. But even if I were to code, 100 screens, I can guarantee the very first screen that I do and the last screen that I do coding manually won't be exactly the same EOM. It's just impossible. The mechanics of using muscle and everything like that, we're just not as good as a machine when it comes to consistency. So something like our ChromaCoat 20, which is on the more economical side, you can get into consistency with a screen room, with an autocoder in your screen room, and you can do it relatively cheap. So I would say if anybody is interested in that a little bit more, reach out to us. In the next few weeks, I'm going to do some videos of one. I've got one shipping down, and I'm going to do some videos on that ChromaCoat 20 in the next couple weeks here. So keep an eye out for those and see exactly how that works and how that can really help you with your consistency in your screen room. Yeah. Good. Excellent. Well, yeah, I appreciate everybody jumping on here again. Keep an eye out. I will do more of this going forward too. And Sean, yeah, I'll post a link to the screen coder here. Just give me 1 second here, and I can grab that for you. But yeah, I appreciate you guys jumping on here and helping out. Great questions, helps out everybody. Like I said, everybody can learn from each other. Nobody started on their first day with perfect screens, and it's a really good way to learn from each other. So here. Thanks for bearing with me. Art, if I use an automatic screen coder, do I have to worry about how much emulsion is in the troughs, or can I just fill as needed? Great question. Yeah, I like to keep them full. If you start to run into it where the screens, as the scoop coaters come together and tip up, and you start to coat your screen and you just don't have enough emulsion in those scoop coaters, you could run into it where the bottom of your screen just doesn't have the same amount of emulsion as you do on the top of your screen. But if you keep those scoop coaters filled pretty well, or keep an eye on that, so the screens, when they come together, you can see that emulsion starts coating on the screen right away. Yeah, you'll be able to have far more consistent screens if you keep them full. Great question. But yeah, I just posted a link right here in the chat section. If you want to pop on there and take a look at that coder. Right now we don't have too much content on there, but we've got a couple photos and stuff of it right now. I think there is one video on there as well, but look for some more in-depth videos coming soon that I'll be putting together relatively soon in the next couple weeks here. Great. Well, then if there's no more questions today, we'll leave it at that. And like I said, I appreciate you guys for stopping on. You're welcome, Susie. Thanks for stopping on. And keep an eye out for more of these going forward and more of the uploaded videos that I'll continue to do. If you have anything that you want to see more in depth on, if you've got an idea for a video that you would like me to do, feel free to shoot me an email at kkauth, that's KKAUTH, at chromaline.com. And just shoot me over any of your ideas. If you want to see me, expose a screen using the exposure calculator or the exposure strip or any of those more hands-on things, feel free to shoot me ideas because I'll be doing more of those technical videos relatively soon. But again, thanks for stopping in, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.